Okay, so we're going to take a look at this how to read a poem PowerPoint. I need to get this set up with a screen share, and away we go, maybe. There we go. So we're going to take a look at primarily how to read a poem. The analogy that I've heard most often, both in my schooling and that I like to use myself, is that poems are very similar to a suitcase, if we're speaking metaphorically. Okay? When you have a suitcase, you have a bunch of stuff in there that when you open it up, in order to be able to access it, you have to unpack that suitcase. And we often refer to poetry as something that we have to unpack, that the meaning is not necessarily going to be straightforward, that we have to look or think metaphorically. We have to look at the words the poet uses. We have to look at the images that the poet uses in order to try and get their point across, all that sort of stuff in order to be able to understand a poem. I've found that most students who don't like poetry, they get frustrated with it because they don't understand the things that they're reading. Now, by going through this process, it will help you with that understanding. And if you understand it better, it follows that you will hopefully, if not enjoy the poems more, certainly be able to get as much out of them as you need in order to be successful in this class. Okay, so we're going to focus primarily on how to read a poem effectively. So, what is a poem? Let's define our terms. Now, we've all read poems before, but there's some things that you need to know about poetry. Dr. Seuss, for example, writes in poetry. And Ham, it's a lyric poem. But you also, Night Before Christmas, you see these things all the time. If you listen to music, you're listening to lyric poetry. Okay, so we've all read poems before, but there are some things that you need to know. Not all poems have rhyme. In fact, I'm in the camp that most good poems do not have rhyme, because English is a very difficult language to rhyme in. And I think sometimes poets can get caught up in trying to keep up the rhyme scheme and not use the word that fits best in the poem to find a word that rhymes. Now, if you have a poet that both rhymes and everything works, and that's somebody who's very special, like Robert Frost. Thomas Hardy is an English poet who rhymes very well, and others. Now, poems also have different formats. They have different stanza lengths, line lengths, different stanzas in and of themselves. Somebody define for me this term, stanza. What is a stanza in a poem? Yeah, like a paragraph, like a break, like a section of a poem. Now, some poems will just be one giant stanza. Others, like the sample that I have on the worksheet that I gave you guys, has 3 stanzas. Poems are written for different purposes. They can be love poems. They can be poems to commemorate an event. They can be a poem that expresses thoughts on something abstract, like an idea or a concept. They can be to a person. They can be about a thing. They can create something that's completely metaphorical. So those are some of those purposes of poetry. Now, let's go with something I'm going to assume the type of poetry that you're most familiar with, song lyrics. What are common topics for songs? Drugs, certainly, especially if you're listening to something in the late 60s, but also women, men, love, what else? Somebody listens to country. Losing your dog, losing your truck, losing your, all that sort of stuff. What? Singing in the mud hole, yeah. What else? What are other topics for lyric poetry, for song lyrics? Struggle, perhaps, yes. Social issues. We've seen that periodically through time, especially during the Vietnam era. There was plenty of songs, the war protests. So we have a lot of different purposes for writing poetry. Now, this PowerPoint comes from English 102, which that's what the page numbers come in for. But these are the steps that come directly from the English 102 textbook, and it's a very good process for understanding a poem. Some students might think that it's a little bit too detailed, but you know what? This process pays off in the end because you're going to understand every aspect of the poem. But before we can break down a poem, we have to have a poem to break down. So we are going to take a look at a poem by James Wright. Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio, which we read on Wednesday. Shreve High Football Stadium, I think of Pollocks nursing long beers in Tiltonsville, and gray faces of Negroes in the blast furnace at Benwood, and the ruptured night watchmen of Wheeling Steel, dreaming of heroes. All proud fathers are ashamed to go home, their women's cluck like starved pullets dying for love. Therefore, their sons grow suicidally beautiful at the beginning of October and gallop terribly against each other's bodies. There's a picture of the poet here on the right-hand side. Also, there's a short clip, which I'll show you guys after. Well, let's go ahead and do the link now. Let's see if it'll let us do it. It will. So while we're waiting for the video. Oh, I need sound, don't I? That would be good. And it's going to not be matched, so forgive me for that. Come on, you. Okay, we'll watch the video after I go over the PowerPoint for the in-class because it's just not going to work. Okay, so what do you picture in your mind when you picture Martins Ferry, Ohio? This is a blue-collar town on the Ohio River, across the river from West Virginia. What, and we can work in stereotypes here if we need to, but what are some things that come to mind? Industrial type towns. So what's the air quality like? Perhaps polluted. How much opportunity is there in a town like this? Not a lot. I mean, imagine a town fairly similar to Bruton, perhaps. You know, a mill town, small town, all of these things that we kind of have come to associate with the Rust Belt. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cut off the video. If you're watching this online, you can watch it on your own. Let me get back to our PowerPoint. Okay, so let's talk about how to read a poem, step one. And this is from that handout that will be posted online, but it's also in class. First and foremost, we want to read straight through the poem to get a general sense of what is going on. You should not stop for hard words or passages. You can come back to those later, especially since all the poems that I assigned you are short. It's not going to be hard to read your poem 3 or 4 times in the process of writing. Read it from beginning to end. Don't stop. Just keep going so you can get an overall sense or gist of what the poet is going after. Poem is in all likelihood not as hard as you might think at first, especially if you see some big words or things you don't know. With a little digging in or unpacking, like I mentioned before, we can get to the crux of the poem. So on that sheet, go ahead and read the right poem to yourself. I'm just going to make sure that video is off. Okay, that's good. Okay, so now that we've gotten the gist of the poem, we can move on to trying to understand the poem's meaning and organization. Now, this is step 2, but there's several parts of step 2 to understanding the poem's meaning and organization. I'm paraphrasing, but the writer Mark Twain said that a large task is a bunch of small tasks that you put together to get a result. And that's really what we're doing here. We're putting a bunch of small tasks together to meet a goal at the end. So what's the first part of this process at looking at the poem's organization and meaning? Look at the poem's title, especially in poetry. The poem's title is going to be informative. Sometimes the entire meaning of the poem is reliant on knowing that title. Some poems, like Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, do not have titles. But in most modern poetry, you're going to have a title. So how is Wright's title informative here? And what is the autumn in the Midwest like? What is the weather like in the Midwest and autumn? Cold, maybe dry. The leaves are changing. If we're taking this to be literal, which we should at least keep in the back of our mind, what's the first day of fall? What's the date? 21st of September. That's the equinox. So, you know, this is definitely smack dab in the middle of football season. And certainly when James Wright would have been going to school, in all likelihood, school did not begin until after Labor Day. So, you know, this is smack dab in the beginning of high school football season. All right, so it is informative to us. The next step is to determine the speaker of the poem, and this is very important. A speaker is not necessarily autobiographical for the author. So when you're writing about poetry, you would not, for instance, say, you know, Wright says, I sit in the high school football stadium. You would say the speaker says, because although a first-person speaker is going to be part of that poet's personality because they're the one that created it, it does not necessarily mean it's autobiographical. In fact, we could make a guess that, or not necessarily a guess, I should say, but we don't even know for sure that this person is from Martins Ferry, Ohio. Now, it does turn out that he is, but it's not a given that a poet is writing as themselves when they use the first person, I, me, we, us, our. First person speakers talk from inside the poem. Other speakers observe action from the outside. This would be like a third person speaker. So what kind of speaker do we have in Wright's poem? First person, third person. Okay, so we have a little bit of the I, but it's a little bit distant. Although the speaker is speaking from within the poem's not necessarily about him. It's the poet observing other things. So our speaker is very much an observer rather than talking about mostly their thoughts and feelings. Okay, so that's something we note as we move on. Okay, so third part of understanding the meaning and organization. Determine the meaning of all words, whether familiar or unfamiliar. When working with poetry, it's often a good idea to have a dictionary handy. We all have a dictionary in our pockets, okay? Your cell phone has a dictionary function, or you can look up the word online. Sometimes the meaning of the entire poem is reliant on just a few words. So it is imperative that you understand all the words. Poetry is the art of the spoken word. So there's usually an economy of words. They don't use any more words than they absolutely have to. So it's important for us as readers, if we want to understand the poem, to understand all the words. So take a look at the poem and let me know words that you don't know the meaning of that you need to know the meaning of. You can just call them out. You don't need to raise your hand. Okay, what's a pullet? Does anybody know? That's Pollock, and which is in the poem. But a pullet, Pullet. Yeah, a young chicken or hen. What's that? So it's the women are talking like a bunch of chickens, which is a really interesting image that he has there, which we can interpret in a number of ways. One, perhaps they're not interested in the football game. Two, if they're the mothers of these children, they may be talking nervously because they're worried about their kids. A Polak, yes, that is a derogatory term from somebody from Poland or of Polish heritage. He also uses the word Negroes, which we don't use very much anymore. But we have to also look at the year the poem was written. I think it was written, in the 60s? So this is common language that wasn't considered derogatory at the time. When we're looking at writing, we always have to look at them through the lens of when they lived. Stuff that may be insulting now is not necessarily insulting when they write it. Polak, as you mentioned, is derogatory, but when he wrote this poem, that's just how you refer to somebody from Poland. So, any other words? I think knowing, where Martin's Ferry is, where Tiltonsville is, those might help us with the understanding of the poem. So we understand that they're words of towns or names of towns, but knowing the geography could help a little bit as well. But yeah, those words that we mentioned are pretty crucial to understanding the meaning of the poem. Okay, so what else can we do to understand the meaning of a poem? Determine the poem's setting and situation. Now, you may notice as we move along here, some of these things start to overlap just a touch. Okay, but that's all right. In a close examination of everything, there's not going to be much that's black and white. So, determine the poem's setting and situation. Some poems have a vivid setting that's important to understanding the work, whereas some poems have a subtle setting or a vague setting on purpose that might add to the nuance of the work. Regardless of what type of setting the poem has, you need to determine if it's important to the work so you can fully understand it. So what's the setting of this poem? Shreve High football stadium, but he also talks about other locations, like what? Tiltonsville, the blast furnaces, a bar where people are drinking long beers. That's kind of a play on words, actually, if you think about it, because you have a long neck bottle, right? But also they're taking a long time to drink it, which implies what? They're in a bar, getting drunk or not wanting to leave the bar, perhaps, or they're trying to escape. It depends on the type of drinking that they're doing. Can somebody please wake her up? Thank you. Either wake up or leave. Thank you. All right. Next step in the process, determine the poem's basic form and development. There are many different ways a speaker can present a poem. Narrative, observational, make personal statements. You can construct a sonnet, which is a 14-line poem. Lyric poetry. There's all sorts of different ways that we can put together a poem. Now, I touched on this on Wednesday, but the speaker will teach the reader how to read the poem by the form and the punctuation. If you remember from Wednesday, we looked at the poem and only one of the lines does not have punctuation at the end. So what Wright is telling us is you should pause at the end of every line except for I think the second to last and the third to last line where they're talking about the sons galloping against each other in the third stanza. How we're supposed to read the poem can affect how we see different lines and stanzas. If you have punctuation, it can emphasize the word on the end of the line. If we don't have punctuation, it can kind of create a very long line over two separate lines in a stanza. Again, this emphasizes different words and ideas, and since different poets have different ways of showing us meaning and insight, where we're supposed to pause as we're reading it can make a big difference. Okay, so what's the form of Wright's poem? How many stanzas do we have? 3. Okay. So what are the basic ideas expressed in that first stanza? Geographical setting, the kind of people that are in the area. What about the middle stanza? Who is the subject of that middle stanza? The women, but people in the stands at the football game. Parents, families. You know, this is small town high school football, so there's probably more people there than just the families. What about the last stanza? Who's the focus there? The sons. Okay, this is pretty common where poets will set up a stanza kind of like a paragraph where there's one set idea per paragraph. Okay, which creates ideas within the poem. I've often tell students that poets usually are very good essay writers because a lot of poems are set up very much like an essay. There's a thesis or main idea. They use supporting evidence to try to prove that idea. And oftentimes the last part of the poem is a conclusion of sorts. So poets, their minds kind of work that way, and they tend to be very good essay writers. And Wright's poem kind of follows that pattern. We have a beginning, middle, and end, where we have a single idea per stanza that backs up an overall idea. Okay. Subject and theme. Now, when you're working on an in-depth reaction to a poem, like you will on the first essay for this class, you're going to be digging into the subject and theme of the poem. Now, a subject of a poem is the general or specific topic that the poem explores. The theme, though, is a little bit less obvious. It's the idea or ideas that the poem is trying to express. Now, the subject of the poem, like I said, is much more clear than the theme. But oftentimes it's up to the reader based on what the poet presents to us to determine the theme or main idea of the work. So, what's the subject of Wright's poem? What is the topic he's discussing? The town, specifically the football stadium, but I think there's a lot of small towns that can be defined by their high school football team. Okay, so what are some of the ideas that this is expressing? What type of people are discussed in this poem? Well, we don't know for sure that they're alcoholics, but you're on the right track. Blue-collar workers are people who work hard. Anybody know the average age of disability for blue-collar work? Close, 46. Yeah, so if you're planning on going into a manual labor job, make sure you get that college degree so you can become a supervisor when your body breaks down. Because, as they like to say in football, Father Time is undefeated. And your body can only take so much. So yeah, the lives of blue-collar people, kind of the depression of the Rust Belt, all these are ideas that are expressed in this poem, but we get to those ideas through the imagery, through the metaphors he uses, the ideas that the poem expresses. Okay, now 101, we don't necessarily have to go super in-depth as we will in 102, but on the third step, now that we've broken down the organization and the ideas of the poem, it's a good idea to read the poem out loud if you haven't yet. Poetry is meant to be spoken. This is the art of the spoken word. In fact, most poetry until probably the last 500 years or so was only spoken and wasn't written down. Homer, the Greek poet's works were not written down until 400 or 500 years after, if the if the poet ever lived, 400 or 500 years after he died. They were memorized by people and passed down. Often, more meaning can be gleaned from reading the poem out loud. And since we're running short on time and I've already read the poem out loud, I'll skip that. But when you are reading, do pay attention to that punctuation. Pause where the author tells you to pause, and don't pause if the author doesn't tell you to pause. You don't pause at the end of every line, okay, when you're reading. You pause where the punctuation tells you to pause. Now, this step is optional for English 101, but it does help a lot of students. Your English 102 textbook tells you to write a paraphrase and an explication of the poem. A paraphrase of a poem will be like paraphrasing when we're using a source when we get to the research papers. We're taking the poem and just putting it into our own words. How is this a useful exercise? Well, when we paraphrase a poem, it forces us to look at every word. It forces us to interpret what we're reading and put it into our own words. So it can help with that understanding of a poem because you have to go through it bit by bit and put it into your own words. Now, an explication is what we're going to be doing on this paper. It's an interpretation or analysis of the poem. You're getting to or expressing the poem's theme. Now, in the context of our paper, our focus on the theme is our reaction to it. But we have to understand or have an idea of what that poem's theme is before we can react to it. You wouldn't want to say, well, I didn't like this poem because I just didn't like it. Or I love this poem because I loved it. You have to look at and unpack the poem to get to the main ideas that the author's trying to express. Okay? So that's the end of my PowerPoint. Are there any questions on this or how to read a poem? Okay, and the explication, if you'd like to see it, is there. Let me go ahead and shut off my PowerPoint here. Don't pack up, we got stuff to do still.